The Crescent Hollow Inn had always carried an air of mystery. Tucked away in a quiet town, it was the kind of place weary travelers stopped at when they had nowhere else to go. But room 306, no one ever stayed there for long. Those who checked in were never seen checking out. It started decades ago, with reports of guests vanishing without a trace. The hotel management always denied any wrongdoing, blaming missing persons on travelers skipping town or faking their disappearances. But the locals whispered otherwise. They spoke of eerie sounds creeping through the hallways at night, of guests who complained about strange figures standing in the corner of their rooms. And worst of all, the ones who entered 306 and were never heard from again. James Carter, an investigative journalist with a taste for the unexplained, had been following the case for months. He was drawn to Crescent Hollow Inn after hearing about the most recent disappearance, a woman named Lisa Holloway, who had checked in just 2 weeks prior. Her belongings had been found undisturbed, her bed untouched, and the door locked from the inside. There were no signs of forced entry, no signs she had ever left. Determined to uncover the truth, James booked room 306. As soon as he stepped inside, a chill settled over him. The air felt heavier than the rest of the hotel, as if the walls were pressing inward. The decor was outdated, frozen in a past decade, with faded wallpaper curling at the edges and a dusty chandelier that swayed slightly, though there was no breeze. He set up his recording equipment, infrared cameras, a voice recorder, and a notebook. If something was lurking in this room, he was going to catch it. The first few hours passed without incident. He noted an unusual silence, the kind that made his ears ring. At around 2:30 a.m., the temperature plummeted. His breath curled into fog before his eyes, and his camera picked up a flickering shadow in the reflection of the old dresser mirror. A whisper. Soft. Right behind him. James spun around. The room was empty. But the door, he was sure he had locked it, was now slightly ajar. He swallowed hard and stepped toward it. That was when the lights cut out. A second later, the door slammed shut, and something in the darkness whispered his name. James' breath hitched as the darkness swallowed him whole. The only source of light was the dim red glow from his recording equipment. His fingers fumbled for his flashlight, but before he could turn it on, he heard it again, his name, spoken in a breathy whisper. James. The voice came from the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed darker than they should be. His pulse pounded as he pointed his flashlight, the beam cutting through the thick air. Nothing. Then, movement. The mirror on the dresser trembled, its reflection warping like ripples in water. James held his breath as an outline slowly formed in the glass. A blurred figure, just beyond recognition, standing directly behind him. He spun around. Still nothing. The air in the room grew heavier, pressing against his chest. His instincts screamed at him to leave, but his journalist's curiosity pushed him forward. He grabbed his voice recorder and spoke, his voice steadier than he felt. If there's someone here, I want to know what happened to the people who stayed in this room. Where did they go? Silence. Then, a slow, deliberate knock sounded from inside the closet. James' stomach clenched. He hadn't checked the closet since he arrived. Swallowing hard, he stepped forward, hand trembling as he reached for the handle. The door creaked as it swung open, revealing nothing but darkness, until he shined his flashlight inside. There, on the closet floor, was a single leather-bound book. Dusty. Old. And when he picked it up, he realized it was a guest ledger. The pages were filled with names, dates of check-ins, but no checkouts. Lisa Holloway's name was the last entry. James' fingers traced the ink, but the moment he touched her name, the closet door slammed shut behind him. The temperature in the room plummeted again. And then, the whisper returned. But this time, it was right next to his ear. You're next. James stumbled back, his breath shallow as the chilling whisper echoed in his ear. His fingers tightened around the old guest ledger, the inked names feeling heavier than before. The closet door had slammed shut, but the air in the room remained still, too still. His heart pounded as he flipped through the pages. Dozens of names. Dozens of dates. Each one marked with a check-in. But there were no checkouts. Lisa Holloway. Edward Finch, Carla Stevenson, David Ross. All of them had stayed in room 306. None had ever left. A shiver ran down James' spine. He had investigated paranormal cases before, but this was different. This wasn't just a haunted room. This was a trap. A faint scratching sound filled the silence. James turned sharply, his flashlight flickering. The noise was coming from the desk, the same desk where the hotel had left its welcome letter. But now, something else was there. The guest ledger had moved. It was now open to a blank page. No, not blank. Ink bled onto the paper, forming letters right before his eyes. James Turner, check-in, February 10, 2025. Check out. His blood ran cold. He hadn't written that. The temperature in the room dropped again, and the whisper returned, closer this time, curling around him like cold breath on the back of his neck. You belong here now. James' flashlight flickered violently. The shadows stretched across the walls, moving unnaturally, bending, twisting, reaching. Then, the door to the hallway swung open violently. A chance. A way out. James didn't think. He ran. The hallway lights flickered as he sprinted toward the exit. His lungs burned, his heartbeat roaring in his ears. He reached the stairwell, practically throwing himself down the steps. Only when he burst through the front doors of the hotel did he finally stop, gasping for air. But as he turned to look back at the building, his stomach dropped. The window to room 306 was dark. Empty. Except for the faint silhouette standing in the glass, watching him. James staggered back, his breathing ragged. The name he had carved into the wall, not his own, still dripped with fresh splinters, the letters burned into the wood as if seared by an invisible flame. The air shifted. The temperature in the room dropped so suddenly that his breath came out in a white mist. The walls no longer whispered, but something else filled the silence. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, approaching from the hallway. James turned to the door, dread clawing up his spine. The handle twisted. Click. The door creaked open just an inch, enough to reveal absolute darkness beyond. A void. Not the hallway, not the dim hotel corridor, just a black abyss, stretching into nothing. James didn't move. Then, a hand emerged from the darkness. Pale. Wrong. Its fingers were too long, too thin, with nails blackened and cracked. They curled around the edge of the door, gripping it with a slow, creaking pressure. James' pulse pounded in his ears. He pressed himself against the far wall, willing himself to disappear. The figure stepped forward. Bare feet. The legs, thin, sickly, covered in something like dust or ash. The body emerged next, clothed in the tattered remains of what might have once been a guest's nightgown. The head hung at an unnatural angle, as if the neck had been broken long ago. But James couldn't look away from the face. Or rather, the lack of one. Where eyes should have been, there was only hollow darkness. Where a mouth should have been, only torn skin and an eternal scream that never made a sound. It stepped further into the room. The door slammed shut behind it. James felt his body go rigid. The thing stood there, unmoving, staring at him without eyes. The only sound was the faint rustle of fabric as it slowly tilted its head. And then, it raised a hand. One bony finger pointed at the wall, at the name James had carved. The thing took a slow step forward. James tried to scream. Nothing came out. The whispers returned, growing louder, voices from behind the walls, beneath the floor, inside his own head. You chose. The faceless figure moved closer. James had made a mistake. The name on the wall was real. And now, whoever it belonged to was coming. James' breath hitched in his throat. His name. On the door. This wasn't just a haunting. It was personal. A wave of dizziness hit him as if the hotel itself had wrapped around his mind, bending reality. He backed away, heart hammering, but the air behind him thickened like an invisible force, pushing him toward the door. The whispers grew louder. "You're home now." A cold, unseen hand brushed against his shoulder. James spun around. The hallway was shifting. The doors on either side melted into the walls, leaving only the one with his name. The lights flickered violently, shadows twisting and elongating. And then, the door swung open. A wave of ice-cold air rushed out, carrying the scent of damp wood and something metallic, blood. James clenched his jaw. "This is what you came for. Go inside." Step by step, he crossed the threshold. The door slammed shut behind him. Inside room 306. The air was thick, suffocating. The room was identical to how he'd left it earlier. The dusty furniture, the dim lamp, the ancient wallpaper curling at the edges. But something had changed. On the small wooden nightstand, the guest ledger from the lobby now lay open. The pages flipped on their own, one by one, stopping at the most recent entry. James Turner. His own signature. His stomach twisted. He hadn't written that. The ink was fresh. Still wet. A low creak sounded behind him. The mirror. James turned, his breath catching. His reflection wasn't his own. A pale, hollow-eyed version of himself stared back, skin sickly and bruised, lips moving silently. James took a step forward. So did the reflection. Then, it grinned. His real body didn't move. Only the reflection did. The grin widened, stretching unnaturally across its face. It lifted a single finger and pointed. James followed the motion. The closet door. It was ajar. A darkness deeper than shadow leaked out from within. James swallowed hard. He felt his feet moving before his mind could protest. His hand trembled as he reached for the knob. The moment his fingers brushed it, the whispering ceased. The room fell deathly silent. Then, a voice. Soft. Familiar. "You were never supposed to leave, James." The closet door burst open. Darkness swallowed him whole. The darkness was alive. James felt it crawling over his skin, seeping into his lungs. He stumbled backward, but there was no longer a floor beneath him, just an endless void pulling him deeper. His screams never echoed back. Then, a single light flickered on. A dim, buzzing bulb swung from above, revealing a room that shouldn't exist. The walls weren't wallpapered anymore. They were covered in names. Hundreds of them. All scratched into the surface, overlapping in chaotic layers. Some looked fresh, the edges of the letters still splintered, as if someone had carved them recently. James' breath caught in his throat. At the bottom of the wall, smeared in what looked like dried blood, was a single phrase. "No one leaves." A cold breath tickled the back of his neck. James spun around. A figure stood in the corner. Barely visible, just an outline in the dim light. But its eyes, two pinpricks of white in the blackness, watched him. The air around James thickened, pressing against his chest. The figure moved. Slowly, deliberately. James took a step back. The figure took a step forward. A voice whispered, overlapping with itself as if coming from 1,000 mouths at once. "You signed the book. Now you belong to the room." James' mind raced. The guest ledger. The fresh ink. It had been a contract. A trap. He reached for his phone. Gone. His pockets, empty. The room had taken everything. James clenched his fists. No. He wasn't going to disappear like the others. He forced himself to look at the names on the walls again. Some were crossed out. Some weren't. A realization hit him. The ones that weren't crossed out, were they still here? Still trapped? A sharp whisper coiled around his ear. "Time to add your name." A rusted nail scraped across the floor. The figure was holding it out to him. James' blood ran cold. The walls seemed to shift, the names pulsing, waiting. If he wrote his name, would that seal his fate? If he refused, would something worse happen? His pulse pounded as the figure inched closer, the nail glinting under the flickering light. James had seconds to decide. And then, the light bulb shattered. Darkness swallowed him whole. James couldn't see. The darkness wasn't just an absence of light, it was thick, suffocating, like being submerged in ink. His breath came in shallow gasps as he pressed himself against the cold wall, his fingers tracing the grooves of the carved names. The rusted nail scraped against the floor again. Something moved. Not footsteps, scratching. From inside the walls. James clenched his teeth, his body frozen in place. The sound grew louder, frantic, as if dozens of fingernails were clawing to break free. Then, whispers. "Let us out. Let us out." A gust of freezing air rushed past him. James' mind screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. He was trapped. The scratching intensified, nails raking against the wood, splinters snapping. Then, a crack. A sliver of pale light split the darkness as a part of the wall buckled. James' heart pounded. He stepped toward it, hands trembling. The crack widened. A single, bloodshot eye stared back at him. James stumbled backward, choking on his own breath. The eye darted wildly, desperate, filled with something beyond terror, something hollow. "It wants a new name," the whispers said. James turned toward the voice. The figure was there, closer than before. The rusted nail in its outstretched hand. "Write it." James shook his head. "No." The whispers turned into hissing. The air thickened, pressing against his ribs, suffocating him. The eye in the crack widened, its mouth, because it had a mouth now, opened in a silent scream. "Write it." The walls shook. The ceiling groaned. James felt the ground beneath him tilt. He had seconds. His name, or someone else's. His hands trembled. His vision blurred. The figure inched closer. The nail touched his palm. James had no choice. With one deep breath, he took the nail. And carved a name. Everything stopped. The whispers fell silent. The wall crack sealed shut. The figure vanished. James collapsed, gasping for breath, the nail slipping from his fingers. Then, the light bulb flickered back on. James turned to the wall. The name he had written was still fresh. Not his own. But it was too late. Somewhere, deep within the hotel, a door creaked open. And footsteps, new ones, walked into the room. James staggered back, his breathing ragged. The name he had carved into the wall, not his own, still dripped with fresh splinters, the letters burned into the wood as if seared by an invisible flame. The air shifted. The temperature in the room dropped so suddenly that his breath came out in a white mist. The walls no longer whispered, but something else filled the silence. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, approaching from the hallway. James turned to the door, dread clawing up his spine. The handle twisted. Click. The door creaked open just an inch, enough to reveal absolute darkness beyond. A void. Not the hallway, not the dim hotel corridor, just a black abyss, stretching into nothing. James didn't move. Then, a hand emerged from the darkness. Pale. Wrong. Its fingers were too long, too thin, with nails blackened and cracked. They curled around the edge of the door, gripping it with a slow, creaking pressure. James' pulse pounded in his ears. He pressed himself against the far wall, willing himself to disappear. The figure stepped forward. Bare feet. The legs, thin, sickly, covered in something like dust or ash. The body emerged next, clothed in the tattered remains of what might have once been a guest's nightgown. The head hung at an unnatural angle, as if the neck had been broken long ago. But James couldn't look away from the face. Or rather, the lack of one. Where eyes should have been, there was only hollow darkness. Where a mouth should have been, only torn skin and an eternal scream that never made a sound. It stepped further into the room. The door slammed shut behind it. James felt his body go rigid. The thing stood there, unmoving, staring at him without eyes. The only sound was the faint rustle of fabric as it slowly tilted its head. And then, it raised a hand. One bony finger pointed at the wall, at the name James had carved. The thing took a slow step forward. James tried to scream. Nothing came out. The whispers returned, growing louder, voices from behind the walls, beneath the floor, inside his own head. "You chose." The faceless figure moved closer. James had made a mistake. The name on the wall was real. And now, whoever it belonged to was coming. James pressed himself against the wall, his breath shallow. The faceless figure stood in the center of the room, its hollow gaze fixed on the name he had carved. The walls trembled. The voices grew sharper, no longer whispers but laughter. A sick, twisted amusement that echoed from every direction. "He chose. He is ours now." The faceless thing lifted its bony hand and traced a finger down the carved letters. The wood cracked beneath its touch, the name warping, twisting, until it spelled something else. James' own name. His stomach lurched. No, that wasn't what he wrote. The figure turned toward him. Slowly, deliberately. Then, it moved. Not walking, gliding. A sudden rush of motion as it closed the space between them in an instant. James couldn't run. The air thickened like tar around him, holding him in place. The figure reached out, its long fingers stretching toward his face. Bang! The door burst open. A flood of light cut through the darkness, and a shadowed figure stood in the doorway. "Don't look at it," the voice commanded. James barely had time to process before the stranger yanked him forward. The grip was strong, too strong, pulling him out of the room in one sharp movement. The faceless thing screeched. The sound wasn't human. As James was dragged into the hallway, the door slammed shut behind him. The whispers stopped. The hallway was empty. Silent. James gasped, collapsing against the cold floor. His rescuer crouched beside him, breathing hard. "That room. It marks people," the stranger said, his voice shaking. "You write the name, it becomes you. You don't get out unless..." He hesitated. James swallowed hard. "Unless what?" The stranger met his eyes. "Unless someone else takes your place." James' blood ran cold. He turned his head, just slightly, toward the door of room 306, and saw the name carved into the wood. Not his own. Someone else's. The whispers returned. And from the other side of the door, something knocked. James' breath caught in his throat. The knocking continued. Soft. Rhythmic. Like something inside knew. The stranger who had pulled him out, an older man, his face worn with exhaustion, grabbed James' arm. "We have to go. Now." James hesitated. His gaze was locked on the door of room 306. His name was no longer carved there. Someone else's was. Who? James' mind raced. Did he unknowingly trade his fate for another? Another knock. Firmer this time. The older man yanked James up, nearly dragging him down the dim hallway. "Listen to me, you got lucky. That thing doesn't let people leave. It trades them." James' stomach twisted. Trades them. The man nodded grimly. "One in, one out. That's why no bodies are ever found. It replaces them. Someone else got taken instead of you." James shook his head, his voice barely a whisper. "Who?" They turned a corner, just as the hallway lights flickered. The old man froze. James followed his gaze. His heart stopped. Standing at the far end of the hallway was a woman. Her eyes hollow, her skin gray and wrong. Her lips curled into a familiar, eerie smile. James felt his knees weaken. It was Amanda. His missing ex-girlfriend. The same Amanda who had disappeared in this very hotel 5 years ago. She lifted a single finger to her lips. "SHHHHH." Then, the lights went out. The whispers returned. And in the darkness, James heard the door to room 306 creak open.